We are really delighted to see you all today, and we're really excited to be joined by some familiar faces and a new face today. So let me introduce who is with us. We have Rabbi Asher Lopatin, who, if you've been with us a while, you recognize. He's the spiritual leader of Kilat Eitz Chaim in Detroit, Michigan, and the past president of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. Asher, you want to wave and say hi?
Hey, Mazel Tov, everybody on the Siyyum.
We also have Rabbi Avi Strausberg, who is the Director of National Learning Initiatives at Hadar, and we've been lucky to have her with us many times. Avi, would you say hello?
Hello, everyone.
Okay, and you have read her, but you might not have seen her face, at least not in a Siyyum yet. And so we're very lucky today to be joined also by Elisa Salzberg. She has written several pieces for us. Sorry, Elisa, didn't mean to talk over you. Elisa holds a master in rabbinics and is currently working on a PhD in Talmud. She's writing a dissertation on gender and war in the Babylonian Talmud, and she writes and teaches about rabbinic texts and Jewish history, and she's joining us today from Jerusalem.
Thanks for having me. So happy to be here for Megillah.
I can see some nice waves for you there. All right. As you know, this is how it works. Each of our panelists have prepared something that they're going to teach on from the tractate. And we're also encourage all of you to share with us in the comments, not only hello and where you're from, but also things that you that struck you as you studied this tractate, things you loved, things that really bothered you, things you have questions about. And we will try to sprinkle some of your comments in between the presentations. So before we get all that started, I always like to just take a step back for just a minute and talk about sort of where we are in this big project, because it's really easy to get lost in the weeds of Daf Yomi. So we have just finished Tractate Megillah. It is the 12th tractate of the Talmud, and it is the 11th tractate in Seder Moed, which is the Talmud is divided into 6 Sdarim, 6 Seders, 6 orders on broad topics. Seder Moed is appointed times. We started it almost 2 years ago with Tractate Shabbat and then Eruvin, laws of Shabbat and Eruvin, and then we moved on to the festivals. We did, I'm not going to get the order right, we did Passover, we did Yom Kippur, we did Sukkot, we did Rosh Hashanah, we did a few other things, and now we are on Purim. So Tractate Megillah was primarily concerned with the laws of Purim, and of course the primary law of Purim is reading the Megillah, though it is not the only run. Also, we talked about giving gifts and giving tzedakah to the poor. And as long as the rabbis were there talking about reading the Megillah, it was a good place for them to file all of their stuff about reading Torah. So the first half of the tractate, we talked a lot about Megillah, and the second half of the tractate, we talked about reading Torah in public. Okay, so that's where we are. Fun fact, interestingly, the tractates are so short right now because we are getting to the end of Seder Moed. The way the Bavli is organized very roughly is that in each Seder, the long tractates are at the beginning, and then the short tractates are bundled at the end. They're sort of in length order. So we actually, after this, have just 2 more short tractates, and then we will finish all of Seder Moed. We will move on to Seder Nashim, which is about the laws of women. And we will again be doing long tractates, and we won't be seeing you quite as often for these Siyyumim at that time. Though, of course, you're always welcome to join us for our weekly Daf Yomi Week in Review class. We love seeing you there too. Okay, so that was a little sort of framing and organization. And let me hand it over to our presenters who are really here to see today. So Rabbi Strausberg, let's start with you this morning.
With pleasure. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. I'm going to share the source that we're going to be looking at. If you're a visual learner and you want to see it, but you could also just stick with me. Don't feel like you need to open that up. So one of the questions that I am most often asked as someone who identifies as a feminist and as a queer female rabbi is, what do I do with the parts of tradition, with the parts of Torah that are particularly challenging or difficult? And the assumption there is that there are parts of Torah that are challenging or difficult, maybe different parts for different people. When I was learning this particular piece of Megillah, Daf 28a and b, I was struck that in this section of Masechet Megillah, I found a potential answer to the question of what do we do with texts that challenge us, that we might not know how to respond to, that are not necessarily, they're the texts in Torah that are on the surface beautiful and easy, and then we just gravitate towards, and they're the texts that sometimes we feel a bit of a distance from. So you could go ahead, and if you want to open that up, I'm just going to share a little bit. So we read in the Mishnah, Ma'aseh Reuven nikra v'lo mitargem. So the story of Reuven, the story of Reuben that we hear in Genesis, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, not a really high moment for Reuven in the Torah. That story we read and we don't translate it. Meaning we we read in the language and we don't make sure that we don't go out of our way to make sure that everyone is understanding it. Ma'aseh Tamar nikra mitargem. The story of Tamar, in which Tamar sleeps with her father-in-law Yehuda, and then he denies it, that whole story of harlotry there. Nikra u'mitargem. That story we read and we do translate, we do interpret and make sure people understand it. Ma'aseh egel harishon nikra u'mitargem v'hasheni nikra v'lo mitargem. The story of the first time we talk about the golden calf, in which the people lose faith and make the golden calf. We read that and we interpret it so everyone understands. The second time that that's mentioned in the Torah, we read it, but we don't interpret it. Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessings, Ma'aseh David v'Amnon, the story of David and his son Amnon, who has problematic a sexual relationship with his half-sister, takes advantage of her, rapes her. Nikra'in v'lo mitargemin. These two things we read and we don't interpret. So we see in the Mishnah, there are sort of two different ways that we can approach texts that might be challenging. We can either read them, but not interpret, not translate them to make sure that everyone understands them, or we could just read them and move on. We're not going out of our ways. And then the Gemara goes on to sort of expand, well, what is it about these various texts that might be problematic? So just for a few examples, Maseh Bereshit, the story of creation, we read and then translate it, and the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious that we would read and translate it. Why would we think otherwise? What would we have thought? We might have thought that if you are telling people the story of creation, they're going to come to ask questions about God, about creation that they shouldn't be asking. Kamash Malan, we don't actually worry about that. Even though telling the story of creation is going to cause people to sort of ask questions that tradition might find problematic, we're not worried about that. We want to make sure they understand it. Again, the story of Lot and his daughters, Nikra u'mitargem. The story of Lot and his daughter is a very, not a story that makes Lot look, or his daughters look great. In the story, in the Torah, we read and we translate it. And the Gemara says, Pshita, this is obvious. What might have you thought? You might have thought that we're worried about Lot is, Lot's related to Abraham. We might have been worried about talking about Lot and his disgrace because it would look bad on Abraham and reflect on him. Kamash Malan, we're not worried about this. A few more examples, the story of Tamar and Yehuda. We read and translate. Pshita, the Gemara says, this is obvious. What we would have thought, we would be worried about the kavod, the honor of Yehuda, of Judah. No, actually the story, even though it tells of sort of something that was disgraceful that he did, it ultimately is coming to praise him. Also, again, we might have thought that we don't read and translate the story of the golden calf. This is a major failure on the part of the Jewish people when they lost faith. They made the golden idol, the ultimate thing we shouldn't do. Pshita, it's obvious that we would. What might you have thought? That we would worry about the honor in Israel? And last, I'll just mention the blessings and the curses. You might have thought that we don't read and interpret them. We don't read and translate to make sure everyone understood. Why? Because we would be worried that the Bnei Yisrael, that they would lose faith, that we would be disheartened when we heard this. And Pshita Kamash Malan, that actually we're not worried about this. So the Gemara, and by the Gemara I mean the rabbis, point out all of these texts that for them were actually problematic, challenging, difficult texts for various reasons. Either they would cause you to ask challenging questions about God we shouldn't be asking. They would cause us to lose faith. They made certain biblical people look bad, and we would be concerned about that. Unless you think, wow, when we approach these difficult texts, we're gonna cut those out. We don't want to say them. Those make us uncomfortable. What the Gemara and the Mishnah here is teaching is, no, even those texts that are hardest for various reasons, and I would gather to say, we might all have different texts that we find hard or challenging or difficult. These are the rabbis' ones right here. They're giving a window into what's hard for them. When we get to those texts that are hard, we don't cut them out. we, at the end of the day, we still read them. We might choose how long, how much time we stay on them. Do we read and translate, or do we just read and move on? But with all of these texts, we want to keep them and we want to read them. And for me, this feels like a really important model of what do we do in our holy text when there are things in our holy text that are problematic and challenging. I think the reading, the to nikra umitargem, to read and to translate them, is to say sometimes we read these challenging texts and we find a way to reinterpret. We find a way to recontextualize, to find ourselves in it, to ask harder questions, to make some sort of meaning in it. We read it and we interpret it, we reinterpret it for ourselves. And sometimes for those texts, we read it and we don't interpret. We read it, we're gonna keep them in, but we're not gonna, these are not the texts that we're going to hold up, that we're going to go too deeply in. But even so, with both of these approaches, what they share in common is we keep them in. We keep them in, we read them, and what we choose to do with them, the questions that we ask, how we wrestle with them, how we reinterpret them, that's on us. That work is on us to do. Passing it back.
Thank you so much. It is so fascinating, isn't it, to see the rabbis admitting and struggling with problematic texts, right? That's something we do all the time, but it is so, there's something really beautiful about seeing that they had that challenge too, and that was for them too, and something they worked through and gave us a model to think about. Okay, we're gonna switch to a little bit of audience participation now, before we go on to our next teaching. So I'm gonna share some of the comments we got. Averel Gulab, I'm so sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name, says, I wonder why there was not much argument when the four most beautiful women were named as Sarah, Abigail, Rahab, and Esther. What about Rachel and Rebecca? Yeah, so, and then I thought I would pair that with Laura S., who says, on the other hand, it's also this whole thing about beautiful women is problematic. Why are we even talking about that? We don't know what the biblical men looked like. And she said, Rav Avi, you might have something in particular to say about beauty in the Bible.
Sorry, I had to find that unmute button there. That I would have something to say about beauty in the Bible in terms of commenting on other.
Why are we talking about beautiful women and not beautiful men?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the short and quick answer is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I think it speaks to the male gaze and the male hand that we see. The sort of presumed who is doing the looking and who is doing the commenting and noting about appearance.
So basically patriarchy.
Patriarchy might be the answer there. Although it looks like Alieza's unmuted herself and might have something to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting when you compare the Bavli to other Midrashim, the Babylonian Talmud to other texts, that the Babylonian Talmud is more interested in sex. And so they're also more interested in women's beauty and the role that Esther plays in the story. So on the one hand, it's obviously the male gaze and it's problematic, but it's also interesting that other texts are more interested in shutting down that conversation and just turning Esther into a maidel, into a sweet little girl who's just caught in this. And the Babylonian Talmud is willing to sort of deal with that hot potato in a way that other texts aren't.
Thank you. We have readers writing, participants writing in with beautiful men in the Bible too. Please don't forget that David looks good, not just according to Michelangelo, and Joseph was beautiful, and I believe there's some others in the comments as well. So check there for participants are sharing beautiful men as well in the Bible.
And Rabbi Yochanan, the whole story with his beauty, and then, with Reish Lakish, and then also there are very ugly men, Rabbi Yoshua, hunchback, and so, men take it a little bit also. So, I don't know.
I love Rabbi Yoshua. All right. All right. So we're gonna try one more thing before we move on to our next teaching. A couple of you wrote to tell us that this was your favorite tractate, and I am going to put you on the spot and invite you to tell us why. So Michael Booker, let's see if we can bring you forward. Ben, can you unmute Michael Booker? I'm gonna just cold call you like like it's class. You're coming to us from Missouri, and you said, I found this the most interesting tractate so far, and I would love to hear why. Did we find him?
Again, of hundreds of faces here. I just, one of the things I really enjoyed is that as a real novice studying this material, I started coming across things I'd recognized in other studies and going, wait a minute, I've heard this before. This isn't brand new to me. And I really enjoy the passages, even when it is kind of weird, where it starts unpacking the stories in the Tanakh and it starts expanding on them and trying to make sense out of them. I think that this is material that is, really engaging, if not, always edifying. It's at least very interesting to read how they're doing that material. So I enjoy the focus on Tanakh, and I, again, was just kind of personally amused to go, wait a minute, some of this I've seen before, and that hasn't necessarily been true of the previous tractates. But thank you for asking.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. Michael, you're in good company. Teresa Sitz also told us that, and she's coming from the Mojave Desert, by the way. She told us that she also loved Megillah. It had fabulous gems. So Teresa, I would just love to hear from you for a minute what really stood out about this tractate to you. See if we can find her. Ben, can you find Teresa?
I was looking through my journal to see which ones I could pull out, but it's going to take me a few minutes, but I'll throw some in the comments. I mean, yesterday's was wonderful when it talked about when you hear a voice behind you and how to tell if it's a legitimate voice that you should listen to or not. I thought that was really wonderful. So that's the closest one that I can remember.
Yeah, that was about the Bat Kol, right? Like,
yeah.
How do you know that that's actually a divine voice
Yeah.
and not in your, how can you know? Lovely. Okay. So thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Michael, and thank you for allowing me to put you guys on the spot and being so gracious about it. We're going to move on and have Alieza teach us something next from this tractate.
Thanks so much. So I found myself really enchanted by chapter 4 of Masechet Megillah, and I have taught it before, but really this idea that we have the power to change the meaning of space. If we talk about the holiness of the Beit Knesset, of the synagogue, and the question of what happens when we need to move, what happens when we need to change the synagogue, break it down to rebuild it, or buy a new synagogue, and where that holiness goes is part of the question that happens in chapter 4. And it's an idea that I've been thinking about, I think is a very deep question that I've had. I have this memory of being in a sterile motel with my parents and realizing that all it took was Shabbat candles and Kabbalat Shabbat of our 4 family members to transform the space into a spiritual place, to transform not only spiritual, but sort of an empty, sterile place into a familiar and warm space. And I think that that's an interesting question in terms of the holiness that a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, is sort of filled with, and then what happens when we leave it, when we move. So I want to discuss a few pieces that actually fall out on a few different dapim, on a few different pages from 26 to 29 within chapter 4, to help us pull together a few different dapim into one picture. So like the holiday of Purim, Beit Knesset is essentially a post-biblical institution. So it emerges like Purim during the Babylonian exile, but it actually takes off and is really running only after the Second Temple is destroyed. So we can imagine that the rabbis have lots of questions, right? Beit Knesset means a gathering place. So is it just a room that some days will be a community meeting and other days will be a spiritual meeting, and the room itself doesn't take on any kind of spiritual aura? Or is it going to hold weight like the temple, right? The temple has been destroyed, and now are we going to build mini temples all over the exile? Or do we need a new model for holiness in this period? And I think that this chapter is so interesting because it really seesaws between a more spiritual and sentimental and lasting sense of the holiness of the temples, of the Beit Knesset, of the synagogues that we build. And on the other hand, much more practical communal concerns that are not as weighty. So if we start with the Mishnah gives us a whole set of rules about a synagogue, both when it's being used and when it's abandoned. And it is all about respect, and it's also about and it basically puts the Beit Knesset on a pedestal, right? You can't make it into a shortcut. You can't use it to dry fruit on its roof. You can't use the land to as a field to grow things. And obviously, most significantly from the first Mishnah, if you sell a synagogue, the Mishnah tells us you have to use the money for something holier, for buying an ark or a Sefer Torah itself, going sort of up the ladder of holiness. Now, of course, the Gemara complicates that, as the Gemara always does, right? And the Gemara says, yes, the Beit Knesset might be holy, the synagogue is holy, but there is a process for desacralizing it. There's a way to change it into mundane space. And as long as the community is in agreement, then the 7 trustees of the city, with the agreement of the community, can sell a synagogue, and then the space is mundane and the money is totally mundane. We had a few interesting stories which give us a sense of this. Rabbi Alieza bought a synagogue in Jerusalem, and he used it for all of his needs, kol tzarchav. All of his needs is often a euphemism for bodily needs, sensual needs, financial needs, really the mundane stuff of life. Rava says you can sell a synagogue and use the money to buy beer. And there's a whole slew of stories here and in a few other Masechtot that show us that it was a very normal thing that happened all the time, to sell a synagogue, to rebuild a synagogue, to desacralize the space altogether. So the short of it is this desacralization process means that there's no lasting metaphysical holiness. The synagogue is sort of a shell. It's temporarily holy because it makes space for the Torah, makes space for the community, makes space for prayers. But it is a holiness that inheres in the community, and the community can move with it or disband, and it doesn't have a lasting holiness. But I think that we all have a sense that there's another side to the synagogue, and it also comes up in this chapter as well. A kind of awesome holiness, sort of sense of numinous, this feeling of God as greater than us, and holiness is something beyond the community. Many people here might be familiar with the nickname we sometimes call a synagogue a mikdash ma'at, a small temple. And the idea that our synagogue is a continuation of the temple in Jerusalem suggests a different kind of model for holiness, the metaphysical sense of God's presence, right? We say there's a verse in Shmot that says, if you build a mikdash, I will dwell in it, right? Asuli mikdash, if you make a sanctuary, so you, the people, build the space, and I will come and bring my presence to it. So it's a partnership, but it's a partnership that makes space for the divine in a sense that we have no control over. And it brings a different model of holiness, one of danger and awe and a necessity to be pure when you enter it. The source of this phrase, mikdash me'at, a small sanctuary, is actually in Ezekiel, in Yechezkel, and it appears when the prophet is talking to the people about their exile, their impending exile. And God says, I have indeed spread them far among the nations, and I have scattered them among the countries. Ve'ehyeh lahem lemikdash me'at, and I will be for them a diminished sanctuary in the countries where they have gone. So this pasuk, this verse, is very powerful. If you can imagine people going into exile the first time after the destruction of the first temple, and God promises them, I will be with you in exile. Now, this may seem obvious to us because Jewish communities live all over the world and have synagogues all over the world. But back then it was really a revolutionary idea. God is not contained in the temple that was just destroyed. God is not limited by the boundaries of the land of Israel. God is mobile and universal. These are some of the foundations of monotheism. So if we get back to our daf, the rabbis actually take this verse very tangibly, right? And they say, "Ve'ehyeh lahem lemikdash ma'at." God says, "I will be for them a small sanctuary." Rabbi Yitzchak says, these are the Beit Knesset, these are the synagogues, and these are the Batei Midrashot. These are the study houses of Bavel, right? There's also a very special value to these locations in Bavel. So it's very interesting because ironically, this statement about God's ability to be everywhere and not confined to the land of Israel, and to tell the exiles that God is going to be with them everywhere, inspires a very tangible question on page 29 in the Talmud, in our chapter. Where in Bavel is God's presence, the rabbis ask. Literally, tell me exactly where I can go visit. Which synagogue should I go to? And they answer, Abaye answers, in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue of Hutzal, Ubebei Knishta Deshaf V'Yativ, and in the Beit Knesset that was destroyed and resettled b'Neharda, in the city of Neharda. This synagogue name just blows my mind, right? It's basically, what do you name the synagogue? The synagogue that was destroyed in Jerusalem, maybe, was destroyed somewhere and found resettlement. And there's actually a suggestion that the stones of the temple were brought to Bavel to build this synagogue. And the Gemara, the Talmud continues and says, don't say that God is now in these two special synagogues. No. On one day, God is in this synagogue, and on the other day, God is in this other synagogue. And I honestly don't know whether the rabbis meant us to take these statements seriously. Can we really talk about God having, office hours in Hutzal on Sunday and Tuesday, and in Neharda on Monday and Wednesday? I honestly don't think the rabbis meant it literally. But these statements and these next two stories that I'm going to end with give us a way to think about these different models of holiness and the different types of holiness that are available to us. So I'm going to read two stories from 29. They're very short. So the father of Samuel and Levi were sitting in the synagogue that was destroyed and rebuilt in Nehardea. And the divine presence, the Shekhinah, came, and they heard a loud sound. And so they arose and they left. So this synagogue was so holy that God visited it, and it was too awesome that people had to leave. This is a model of holiness that reminds me of the temple, where the Holy of Holies is only visited once a year by the Kohen Gadol, where you have to purify yourself to be ready to come in. And we have to ask ourselves if this is the model that we want for our own Beit Knesset, for our own synagogue. So the Gemara also asks this question: is this really the Beit Knesset? Is this really the synagogue that we want? And it follows with a second story, very similar to the first. Rav Sheshet was once sitting in the synagogue that was destroyed and rebuilt in Neharda, and the divine presence, the Shekhinah, again came, but Rav Sheshet did not go out. The ministering angels were frightening him in order to force him to leave, and Rav Sheshet turned to God and said before him, Master of the universe, if one is wretched and the other is not wretched, who should defer to whom? God then turned to the angels and said to them, leave. So Rav Sheshet calls himself wretched. He might mean all of humanity compared to God. He might mean he's an old man. You really want to make him jump up and leave the room. But I think essentially he's saying to the divine presence, this is a place for humans. We can't stand the intensity of God's presence on a daily basis in the synagogue. And if you think about it, we want our synagogues to be a place for Yom Kippur davening of the utmost awe and seriousness, but also the place for the Purim spiel, for the funny Purim plays. We want to have bat and bar mitzvah parties, but we also might want to have a neutral fundraiser or a social gathering. And if God's presence was in the Beit Knesset, was in the synagogue, how could we ever sell it or refurbish or break it down? or move from one neighbor to another. So one way of differentiating these two models that the chapter gives us is between a legal and more of a spiritual meaning kind of level, a halachic level and a nagadic level. On the legal side, we say, you can sell a synagogue, there's a process for desacralizing it, and you can do it. On the emotional level, I think we all have a gut feeling that sometimes don't necessarily want to sell a synagogue to be a church or a bowling alley or a strip club, right? And we're complicated like that. On the one hand, we grow attached to buildings and we create an aura that allows us to enter a spiritual mindset by treating the synagogue differently and special. But on the other hand, we have a spectrum of experiences and needs, and the synagogue needs to fulfill all those things for us. And we combine in our synagogues today the intensity of spiritual experience of the divine and the mundane needs of the community. And the beauty of the Gemara in this chapter is that these models coexist, and the Gemara never fully decides on either of them, enabling us to see the synagogue in both of these lights.
Amazing. Thank you for showing us both sides of that discussion and bringing those beautiful stories to us. You've also, Elisa, I don't know if you can, you probably can't watch while you're talking, but you've inspired quite a conversation in the comments. People are talking about the synagogues they know, and many of which have synagogues they grew up in that have been converted to churches. And one or two of you have also commented that you're in a position I was in as a kid, which is a synagogue that used to be a church. So you're sitting in a structure that feels like a church, but it's actually a synagogue. And there is something very strange and unsettling about that. And I think one person also commented that this is an especially American phenomenon for us. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give it a larger context, there's some really interesting texts written about Cairo synagogues that were completely abandoned when the Egyptian Jews made Aliyah to Israel. And so it's not actually only American, but it's certainly still a very live issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the church synagogue thing, especially in America, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that, especially where I grew up because of zoning, because like zoning for a house of worship was very specific. So I wonder if that also played into how often a building would go back and forth between being a church and a synagogue. But that is purely speculative on my part. If you know more, please share in the comments. You guys are a wealth of information. So I'm going to share just a few more comments and then we'll go to our last presentation. So a couple of you, I just wanted to highlight a couple of you shared other passages and ideas you loved from this tractate. Nancy Kaplan shares that one of my favorite lines from this tractate is the one about how much merit there is in quoting one's sources because it brings redemption to the world. That's how important it is to share who taught something and to give credit where credit is due and keep alive not only the teaching, but the teacher. Daniel Rosenbaum shares, I liked that the rabbis were worried about dropping a Torah off the reading table and how to properly cover it. I'm sure they were speaking from experience. John Hartog shared, I was touched by the discussion on the quote, humility of God. I also like the concept of holy space. And continuing the discussion on humility, Friedel Brief shared the idea that God has the quality of humility is another example we've seen of giving God human attributes that in some way makes God more accessible to us. For me, the message in the daf was that God is concerned about the welfare of the humble, and we too should be empathetic to the marginalized who are also created in the image of God. Now we need to settle a very important question, panelists. Betsy Frank would like to know, what was Esther's real relationship to Mordechai? I see looks of concern and giggles among you. Would anyone like to take a stab at this one? It says both, right? That she was a niece and a cousin. Is that right? That she was sort of acted as an adopted daughter?
Levat as a daughter, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a husband and wife, that's that. I think that's the, I don't know. I think that's the relationship that, yes, they were married. Yeah, certainly.
What? Did I miss this?
Yeah.
Are you pulling my leg?
That's why having relations with the king might have been a big issue. And Karka, well, when we get to Tubot, it'll come up.
Guys, I've learned something really new today. Okay. Apparently
But I
they were
think only
married.
in the Bavli. I think only in the Babylonian Talmud.
Okay.
Again, with the interest in the sexuality of its character.
This is not confusing at all. Okay. All right. Peretz is always helpful coming in with the scholarly citations. He says Amos Funkenstein posited that there were two narratives stitched together, and that's part of why there's some confusion about what's going on in the text. And then apparently also the Bavli decides they're married.
So they really are the same person. Mordechai, is that what Peretz is saying? Rabbi Peretz is saying?
No, I think he's saying that there might be two stories stitched together in Esther. Is that what you're saying, Peretz? Ben, if you can get Peretz forward for us. Yep, he's giving me a thumbs up. He's still muted, but I see him giving, yeah, that might be two narratives that have been stitched together. Many biblical sources work this way. Of course, most famously the Torah and the theory of the four sources, especially like E and J in the early narratives, and it looks like what happened is you had this story and somebody went like this and put them together like this. And that's why there's some interesting repetitions with some interesting differences. Source criticism is awesome. We're not going to get into it today, though. Okay. We also got a question that's going to lead right into your teaching, Asher. So I'm gonna leave us with this comment. Someone, and I'm sorry, I forgot. When I copied and pasted over here, I didn't catch the person's name, so I apologize. I can't give that, but is wanted to talk about the honor of the congregation and women. Like this was a surprise. We get an opportunity and then it gets yanked away. I think we're talking about the idea that women cannot read Torah because it would do a disservice to the honor of the congregation. That's how I read that comment. Asher, I know you're going to teach on that, so I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much for whoever that anonymous person was that pointed it out. And I just want to say regarding Elisa's point that I was recently in Dubai, and there's a man there that goes to Baghdad once a year. He's Jewish and he lived in Iraq, and he goes to Baghdad and, talking about all the holy places in Iraq. So we got to get back to Iraq and get back there and visit all the holy sites and find God there, in one of those synagogues. So, but yes, how can, I'm a modern Orthodox rabbi, and one of the issues Orthodoxy struggles with is egalitarianism and the role of women, especially in services. It's really worked out pretty well, women's learning and venerating women learning, and even kind of dealing with women's leadership and women rabbis, but really having a hard time with what can women do in the synagogue. And so it's fascinating that, yes, this Breita on 23a, I say a Breita. Breita is one of these teachings that are the same time as the Mishnah, but were not included by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. Probably found him too controversial or didn't agree. There is another version of this that's in another source, Tosefta, but this is a Breita. Hakol Oli Laminyan Shiva. So exactly as our questioner or the commentator pointed out, it first starts out with a very bold statement that everyone is allowed to step up and be one of the 7 people that get aliyot to the Torah, that are allowed to read Torah. Presumably these are people that read Torah, one of the 7 sections that we read every Shabbat of each portion during Shabbat. And even a child, even a woman, afilu isha. But then it says, but our rabbi said that a woman shouldn't read lo tikra b'Torah. Why? mipnei kvod tzibor, for the honor of the tzibor. So there's a big question, and Rav Sperber, Rav Mendel Shapiro, many others have really looked into this, and perhaps maybe there are many different reasons why would it not be honoring the tzibor, the community, to have a woman read Torah. Well, maybe in those days, that was, maybe in those days, whatever, patriarchal society, whatever you want to say, it might not have been, but maybe that changes. And Rabbi Sperber says maybe kvod habriot, the respect that we have to have for all humanity, trumps this kvod hatzibor, the sort of narrow confines of respect for kind of the traditional minyan. And perhaps some congregations, even the women that are members, would rather it be non-egalitarian, and other ones would rather it be egalitarian. So this is a really big discussion. I see Betsy Frank says, but not minyan. Not so clear. It's not so clear that women don't count in a minyan. And Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik is quoted as saying that actually the only reason women don't count in a minyan in traditional Orthodox synagogues is the same reason, kvod hatzibor. So if this is something that progresses, that changes what is considered honorable, again, depending on the synagogue, depending on the time period, this is something that might change as well. And it's just really powerful, again, to go back to the beginning, that it just seems that the heart and soul, I would interpret the heart and soul of the Talmud is that they want women to be included, but they're dealing with the reality of their time. That might be, wishful thinking, but that's sort of where I am. And I just, in one more minute, I just cannot resist, this Megillah, it's such a realistic, understanding the way things really are kind of tractate. It's fascinating that we have also this beautiful idea that the reason there's a blessing before, this is on 21b and 22a, a lot of reason why there's a blessing before each aliyah, before you go up to the Torah, there's a blessing, and then there's a blessing to say afterwards, is because mishum hanichnasim, mishum hayotzim, because of the people that come in late to synagogue, and they'll come in, and if there isn't a blessing, they might not realize that there was a blessing said 15 minutes ago by the first person getting up and getting their aliyah. And then the people that leave synagogue early, they might not realize that there's a blessing at the end that's going to come in like 15 minutes when the last person reads from the Torah. So the rabbi said that everyone who gets an aliyah, we're hoping that people at least can stay in synagogue for 5 minutes and can hear the blessing before and the blessing afterwards. But I think, as a pulpit rabbi, I understand this. People get shpilkadik. They got shpilkadik. I don't know if we have to interpret that. That means like, utzadik. I don't know. People have to walk around. They got to go to Kiddush Club. They got to go check out this, whatever it is. It's hard for people to stay in synagogue for 1, 2, or 3 hours. So that's not new. It's not America. It's just not anything. It was there in Babylon. It was there in Israel way back. And it's good to see that the Jews were the same people. It's great. It's great. So love this tractate. It's really just filled with love for Amcha, for the people, and how we live in a joyous way, very in keeping with the holiday, I think, of Purim and the victorious story of Esther.
Thank you so much. There's obviously so much more to discuss there, and there is a lively chat going on in the comments in response to what you have said, Asher. We are going to try and keep this to an hour, though, so we're going to move forward, and I am going to hand the virtual microphone back to Rabbi Strausberg to bring us to a conclusion in this tractate. Of course, someday we hope to return, but Avi, why don't you give us the last few lines here?
No problem. Here we go. So the last few lines, beautiful last few lines, you'll recognize them from the Kiddush, from Yom Tov, or on a festival day. The verse will be a little bit familiar. Vaydeber Moshe et moedei Hashem el bnei Yisrael. quoting from Vayikra, that Moses declared to the children of Israel the appointed seasons of the Lord, the times of God. And then we read, Mitzvatan sheyu korinotan kol echad ve'echad bizmano. It is commanded that Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, should be reading those relevant sections of Torah, each one in its correct time. So that on Pesach, we read about Pesach, on Shavuot, we read about Shavuot in the Torah. Tanu Rabbanan, we learn, Moshe tiken lehem liYisrael sheyu sho'alim v'dorshin be'inyano shel yom. Moshe established for them, for Bnei Israel, for the children of Israel, that they should be asking questions and learning about the matters of that day on that day. What does that mean? Hilchot Pesach, b'Pesach, Hilchot Atzeret, b'Atzeret, Hilchot Chag, b'Chag. That we should be learning, studying the laws of Pesach on Pesach, the laws of Shavuot on Shavuot, and the laws of Chag, there we're talking about Sukkot on Sukkot. And that's the end of it. I'll say two things about it. One, I just think it's really special to have, there's so much learning we could be doing at any given moment, sort of an overwhelming learning. And so there's something for me that's always really powerful of that narrowing in of when you get to the holiday, just do the learning of the holiday. And even that, there's still so much you could be doing, but sort of that guidance there. What do you do on Pesach? You learn about the laws of Pesach. What do you do on Purim? You study the laws of Purim. And not sometimes the ends of the tractate, you can find the rhyme or reason for how it connects to the tractate. This is such a beautiful and sort of easy sort of button end of this tractate, in the sense we're a couple months out from Purim, depending on when it falls. And so it's a reminder for us. We sort of did the early preparatory learning for Purim now by learning Masechet Megillah, and so a hope and a blessing to all of us that we should come back to this learning. We should remember this learning in a couple months when we get to Purim, and really the Masechet Megillah will return to us, and we will return to it. So with that, we'll go right into the Hadran. So I imagine we'll probably pull that up on the screen. I'm pulling it up as well. Want to wish all of you a Yasher Koach if you are making a Siyyum on this, inviting you at home, muted, but at home to say this Hadran along with me. Hadran alach Masechet Megillah v'hadrach alan da'atan alach Masechet Megillah v'da'atach alan la nitnashe minach Masechet Megillah ve'la titnashe minan ve'la be'alma haden ve'la be'alma da'ateh. Yehi ratzon mefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu shetehei toratcha umanotenu ba'olam hazeh u'tehei imanu le'olam haba. Chaninu bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Sorcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Harev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei toratcha befinu ufipiyot amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh kulanu anachnu v'tzetzainu amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yudei shmecha levomdei toratcha me'avai techakmenu mitvotecha ki leolam hili. Yehi libi tamim bechukecha lema'an lo evosh leolam lo eshkach pikudecha ki bamchi tani baruch ata Adonai lamdini chukecha amen 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 Selah va'ed.
Okay, I will pick it up from here. Modim anachnu lefanecha. We are so grateful, Hashem. Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei shesamtech alkeinu miyoshvei beit hamidrash, that you allowed us to be part of those folks that sit and learn Torah. The lo samtech alkeinu miyoshvei kranot, and you didn't make us those folks that are spending their time doing something else. Sha'anu mashkimin behem mashkimin. Everyone wakes up early. Anu mashkimim Torah, but we wake up to the powerful words of Torah. The hey mashkimim, the divarim betelim. Other people, they wake up. Who knows what they're doing? We know we're doing Torah. Ama anu amelim, the hey amelim. We're working. They're working. Everyone's working. Anu amelim becoming schar. We know that we get reward. We're changing the world through the Torah we're learning. Anu ratzim, the hey ratzim. Everyone's running in this world, and that's okay. But anu ratzim l'chai olam haba, we are running towards things that are eternal. V'hem ratzim lever shachat, not some other folks. Shneimar ve'ata Elohim toridein lever shachat, kind of tough language. Anshe damim u'mirma lo yechatzu yamehem v'ani eftach bach, but I will trust in you. Shekishem says, Tanu l'sayem Masechet Megillah, just you have helped us finish Masechet Megillah, Kintaz Reinu Ladchil Masechtot Sfarim Achrim L'Sayim. Help us begin other tractates and finish them, L'Model Lamed, to learn and to teach, Lishmor V'Lasot, and to fulfill L'Kayem Kol Devei Talmud Torah Be'ava, U'Zchut Kol HaTanaim V'Amorim V'Tamidei Chachamim V'Amod Lanu L'Zareinu Shel Tamusha Torah Mipinu Mipizarenu Ad Olam. Let this Torah last with us forever. L'Kayem Banu B'Halechacha Tancheo Tach B'Shoch B'Cha Tishmor Alecha. When you walk, it'll be with you. V'Hakitota. When you wake up, the heat to sichecha, ki bi yiru yamecha v'yasivu l'chashon chayim orachimim b'yina b'smola osher v'chavod. Adonai oz la'amo yitain. God gives strength to God's people. Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. May God bless the Jewish people with peace and the whole world with peace. And let us rise for the Kaddish, the special, unique Kaddish that's only said at a Masechet, at a Siyyum. And please, again, feel free to join in and say it with me. You see some fascinating language about the temple, which we discussed earlier. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi. V'amadihu atid litchareto l'chayametai. L'asaka yaton l'chayal ma'olamivne. Karted Yushalem. Ulshachlel hechalei b'gaveil me'acher pulchan anuchra minara ula'atava pulchan anishma la'atra yamichku chabrichu ma'achutei v'karei v'chayechon uv'yemechon v'chay l'chol beit Yisrael b'agalav zman kari v'imru amen. Yeshemei Rabbam rachlam me'almayah barach v'ishtabach v'par v'tramam v'tnasei v'nadar v'alev v'alau shmei d'kudisha b'richu le'elam in kol berchata v'shirata tush berchata v'nechamata damiram be'alma v'imru amen. And let's insert a blessing for all those who are learning Torah. Al Yisrael v'Rabbanan v'al Tamidehom v'al Kol Tamidehom v'Kol Man Daskim Be'oraita Di'Vatra Hadeim v'Di'B'Chol Atar v'Atar Yehelon Olchon Shlama Rabba China v'Chista v'Rachamei v'Chayei Arichei v'Zonei Rivichei for Kanami Kodam Av Nishmai v'Ara v'Imru Amen. Yehei Shalom Rabba Nishmai v'Chaim Tovim Aleinu v'al Kol Yisrael v'Imru Amen. Oh, say shalom b'mromav, hu barachamav yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May God who makes peace in the heavens through the Torah we are all learning, please make peace on earth, and let us say amen.
Amen. Thank you. Asher, somebody commented that your way of reading and translating, as we have learned from this tractate, really mirrors the way that texts were read in public in antiquity, this sort of reading and translating as you go. This is in some ways an approximation we now know of how people might have heard Torah and Megillah in antiquity. So that's awesome. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Alieza, for joining us for the first time. We hope you will come back and join us again. Avi, always a pleasure. Asher, always a pleasure. And it is so lovely to see all of you. Thank you for the spirited comments and for the participation, for being game for me calling on you. It's really wonderful to learn with all of you. And we will be excited to see you tomorrow when we start Tractate Moed Katan.